Welcome, friends. We are letting folks make their way in from the waiting room, and we will get started in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you to all of you who are joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Transforming Renewable Energy Conflicts, a Roadmap to Smooth Implementation. And thanks to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. It is increasingly easy to find consensus that the climate crisis is real, fossil fuel emissions are a huge part of the problem, and that we must rapidly and equitably transition our economy to clean, renewable energy. But there is a reason that we are all familiar with that phrase, the devil is in the details. Things start to get complicated when we move from the general concept of renewable energy to the specific details of individual projects. It matters where and how and at what cost we deploy clean energy. And it matters how we grapple with the conflicting perspectives that emerge through those conversations. Dr. Lawrence Susskind is with us today. He is the Ford Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning at MIT, and he is working to flip the narrative around renewable energy projects and teach a new generation how to combine data analysis with mediation to identify potential conflicts early in the development process, reducing opposition, preventing delays, and ensuring smoother implementation of renewable energy projects. Dr. Susskind founded the Consensus Building Institute and co-founded the program on negotiation at Harvard University, so he knows a thing or two about conflict resolution. We are so grateful to have you with us today, Larry. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from our speaker first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you. We'll synthesize and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties today, Maggie is the one to help you out. Send her a message through the chat and she will work her magic. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where there are a bunch of different playlists to help you focus in on the topics you find most interesting. Thank you all again for joining us. And Larry, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. I will try to keep my opening statement short, but I hope provocative, so that there's a chance to get back and forth with as many people as possible. And I have offered If we don't get to cover your question, um, the organizers have, I'm sorry to make more work for you, have said they would take the questions that came in, cluster them together, send them along, and I will try to write out what I would have said if we could have taken the questions, and that'll be posted on the website. Think about any facility siting process regarding any kind of energy in the United States. There's something fundamentally wrong with the underlying logic of the way we require siting to be done. We say when a developer has a proposal that they are ready to put forward, typically a private actor, could be a public entity, but it's rarely a public entity, that private actor puts forward a proposal, and what do we expect? We expect that if through a process of hearings or organized meetings run by a siting agency or by a local entity, it can be established that the gains to the gainers, the people who will get new, less expensive electricity, the people who will get electricity who didn't have electricity at all before, that the gains to the gainers outweigh the losses to the losers. Hey, there's going to be some people locally, they're not going to be happy because the world is going to change. They may lose their land. They certainly will lose the use of adjacent land, which is being appropriated for use for a wind farm or some other kind of energy producing facility. But it's only a few people. And we guarantee that minimum environment and health standards will be met. So if the gains to the gainers outweigh the losses to the losers, and that's presented in a public way where people have a chance to make comments because it's a democracy, and the siting board decides that from the materials submitted by the developer, the project is acceptable, then they're supposed to grant a permit. Now, what if we said, well, but that's not fair. Why should a few people have to bear the cost of a loss in a variety of ways so that the majority can benefit by having a new facility or by responding to problems and challenges of climate change? Why not tax some of the benefit and use it to hold those who, through no fault of their own, are losing property value, are losing access to various kinds of ecosystems, who are representing various kinds of ecological and social uses of space that are being given away or ignored? Hold them harmless. Think of a way to design, locate, manage, fund this facility plus so that there are no losers. And you know what? If there aren't sufficient gains to the gainers to compensate, mitigate, or otherwise hold the potential losers harmless, maybe it's a bad project. Maybe it's a project in the wrong place, designed with the wrong technology, put in the wrong location. Of course, you wouldn't know that under the existing system because the way it works is word of what's being planned doesn't come out until after key decisions are made. A developer, in an effort to keep the cost down of lands nearby they may need to purchase or rights they may need to purchase, doesn't want anyone to know that a facility is being built. So they use what real estate people call straws to inquire. They buy rights, they buy land. And when they have a firm idea of what they want to do, they put a business plan together. They look for an investor. They hire a consultant, could be from another country, using air photo interpretation, but they're known for being able to produce an environmental assessment for a proposed site in a proposed place. And when all that's gathered and they feel they can defend their choice, that's when they come to talk informally, supposedly, with the people in the place. This is the process that has gotten us in different parts of the United States instances in which, when the announcement is made, tribal groups will say, well, if you had talked to us, you're looking at 6,000 acres covering tribal land. But if you talk to us, the spot you're talking about, the 1,000 acres in that very large area, you're taking sacred lands. You couldn't pick another spot in the 10,000 acres. If you had talked to us, we could have kept you from making this mistake. Or environmentalists waking up to discover, if you had talked to us, we would have said, you need to look at the map of endangered habitats in this area. We don't know who's working for you. We don't know how they prepared an environmental assessment in a preliminary way without discovering this is a mapped habitat. You have proposed a facility in the middle of it. There's plenty of space within the larger area you're looking at. But under the circumstances, we have to oppose what you are proposing. You've made mistakes. You could have avoided the mistakes had you talked to knowledgeable stakeholders and engaged them in a problem-solving process. What's the problem? How to meet the developer's interests, and this is the plus that I mentioned quickly a moment ago, and simultaneously meet as many other interests of that community in that region as you can. Don't just minimize environmental impacts of what you've chosen to do. Design what you're going to do to maximize the range of things that could be done in conjunction with, as part of the project being proposed. This infrastructure is going to change. Great. Let's take the existing infrastructure improvement plans in the region and see how this project can advance multiple interests, create benefits. Won't happen unless all those interests are in the conversation. Not in the conversation about yes or no for what the developer has in mind, because they've invested all their money in designing one design based on what they could find out secretly, but rather engage in a conversation aimed at maximizing benefits to the whole community. And if there are going to be people, places, groups adversely affected, water's not going to be available, hunting's going to be restricted, roads are going to have to be changed and moved, whatever it is. What is the compensation? What is the mitigation that now has to become part of the social cost of the proposed project? You can try to minimize that by engaging groups in joint problem solving and joint fact finding, but you may have to take part of the profits in the business plan, in the business model that attracted the investors, and say, there's social costs. These have to be included. And all of this has to be worked out before, not after, a permit is granted. And I would say at the heart of the conversation that needs to go on is a discussion with appropriate local actors representing the full range of stakeholders, cannot be selected only by local officials. And I can describe a process to you by which a neutral party is brought in, maybe at the request of the state that has to give the permit, and paid by the state that has to give the permit, to first do an assessment of who are the local stakeholders, who can speak for them, and speak with all of the possible stakeholders privately, one-on-one, not for attribution, and come back with a map of the stakeholders, their interests, and a proposed agenda and a set of ground rules, and then send that to everyone interviewed and say, would you participate in this process? Not run by the developer, not run by the siting agency, not run by the local board, if there's any local board that's still allowed to be involved, given that we have already New York, California, Illinois, that were so upset by initial local reaction to proposed renewable energy facilities that they changed the state law and preempted any local involvement in renewable energy siting of facilities of a significant size. That's terrible. It's exactly the opposite thing. They thought they were going to speed up the process, get past the local resistance by just superseding local involvement. All that's going to do is move all that local reaction, one could say hostility, to the state level where the so-called hearing is now supposed to happen. I would argue a very different way of acting is to say the proponent of the project, the developer, must submit a community benefit agreement. And state legislation, state regulation needs to say how such a thing has to be produced to ensure fair public engagement, and that local officials have to sign the product of a mediated conversation, which has only a certain amount of time in which it has to happen. So we're not extending any of the length of time it takes to get a permit. But the regs need to say, where's your community benefits agreement? Where's the endorsement of the local government, which isn't going to endorse it? They have discovered in places that tried to do versions of this, because the local officials said, we don't have any clear statement from our citizenry that this is how they think this project could go ahead and provide maximum benefits and hold potential losers harmless. So my argument is, every time someone comes with yet another proposed wind farm or solar farm or geothermal project or offshore wind project, I'd say, what have you done to gather the stakeholders and engage them before key decisions were made? And what have you done to ensure fairness in that process through the use of a neutral party facilitating, not advocating, not working for any of the agencies, only working to ensure a fair process? And what has been the strategy for compensating or mitigating the losses? And how will this be made enforceable so there is no legal action required? The permit is granted by the state and now subsumes the community benefit agreement because it was required by the state, and the state now has to enforce it. So that's a very different model. It challenges the basic assumptions about how we've been doing siting. Just because the majority's doing fine and only a small number are upset, these are not selfish people trying to stop change. These are legitimate stakeholders whose interests ought to be addressed, especially if they were stakeholders whose interests have been not addressed in the past in the same region, which is very common. And my sense is we need to change all 50 state siting laws to include requirements for real stakeholder participation in the production of a stakeholder assessment, and then a community benefit agreement, which has components stipulated in the regs, and that all has to come with signatures from the local officials after a process of full engagement of stakeholders to the siting agency, which then, if it does give the permit, becomes the enforcer of those terms. Now I'll stop there and see if I have provoked anybody.
I think you've done this before and you know the answer to that question, Larry. Yes, you have definitely provoked some really interesting thoughts and questions. We're going to get into those. And I want to remind everybody that you can keep sending questions to me or to Maggie through the chat. Also want to remind you that we're going to pull together a lot of these resources and conversation, and you'll get a follow-up email later this afternoon with a whole bunch of ways that you can continue to think about, talk about, and move forward with these really interesting ideas. So I want to start by saying I love this process. I love what you're laying out. I heard, proactive project design that's not led by the developer, extensive intentional stakeholder engagement that happens before decisions are made, strong community benefits agreements required and enforced by the state. Did I hit the big pieces?
Yes, I will go with that. There's also, inside of the consultation that goes on between the developer, the community, and any interest groups and individuals that want and have a right to participate, a process of joint fact finding. So much of the conversation is driven by people finding something on the web that supports what they heard from someone. And so we're sure that if a wind farm is this far from where people live, they will all suffer from the following mental health problems. And there is legitimate research on the issues of how wind farms within certain distances affect people's ability to sleep and so on. But you want to know what that distance is, and you want to know whether that's a function of prior conditions. And there's fact finding for each case that needs to be done. And the fact finding that you have done now is done in an adversary fashion. It's done by someone asked by one side who already made up their minds about the project. But inside of a truly mediated process, the parties would agree on who should do the work, what the deadline was, and then that would produce information, not conclusions, not prescriptions, just the best information with all of the points of disagreement that are out there, but something to help people move into a proposal realm where they can say, and I can tell you, we have examples of this having worked, where someone says, if you really would change the height, design, location, speed of the turbines and move them at least as far away and create a visual block, we can get an agreement. Because people aren't going to see or hear or lose value or suffer other problems. And they are convinced of that at the point at which they are agreeing. Or they're taking money that fully values their home at its highest possible value now and deciding to move somewhere else in that general area if that project's really going to go ahead at no cost to them. The move is, they're held harmless for the move. So it's in the process, there's joint fact finding. In the process, there's collaborative problem solving.
there's a real interest in hearing a success story. Can you tell us, can you share an example of where this has worked, just to give us something to sink our teeth into?
At MIT, we now have something called the Renewable Energy Facility Siting Clinic. Communities come to us. We put trained teams of students together to work for all sides if they agree to participate. If they don't, we don't work for them. But if we get all sides, meaning the major players that we've listed so far, and those conversations are not open to the press. Those conversations are a chance for people to think new thoughts, to think out loud. You're not going to do that at a public meeting with all your neighbors watching who've made up their minds and want to know where you stand. But we have done this now several times for sites in New York State and for sites in Massachusetts and for sites in Michigan. It is not easy to get all the parties in the first instance to say they want help. But we have managed in several locations. And our website, renewable-energy.mit.edu, has 53 short case studies of projects that were stopped from one coast to the other. But 14 of those began again when the developer threw in the towel, quit, went bankrupt, sold what they had by way of rights to the site. And what is the first thing the new developer did? We better sit down with all the people who were opposed and block this, which they did. And new versions of these projects emerged. And in 14 of those cases, those projects went forward. They all didn't have everything that I'm now describing to you, but that research on those 50 plus cases is what led us to conclude that the sloppy newspaper coverage yelling NIMBY completely misconstrued the fact that there are groups with legitimate concerns and whose interests can be met at the same time as some version of a project, maybe at a different site, maybe at a different height, maybe with a different technology, maybe with a different guarantee of who has the jobs. All kinds of things can be changed to compensate and mitigate perceived losses. And we also have an online course through MIT X, which is free, which you can take 3 hours a week for 4 weeks, but it's on your own time. And it includes conversations with 60 different people around the country, including several sites where tribal groups have managed to renegotiate the terms of what was proposed by a developer and ultimately came to an agreement that the tribes thought were to their benefit because it included not just changes in what the developer wanted to do, but guarantees to meet other interests of the tribe that are linked to what was being proposed, and change in location and change in where turbines would be located and so on. That case study is with all the people involved, in their words, within this online course of resolving renewable energy siting disputes through MITx. So there are cases you can hear about in more than the 30 seconds I could devote to a case right now.
Thank you. And that is exactly the kind of thing that we're going to follow up with. So if you're trying to jot down email addresses, relax. I promise we'll send you all of those links, and you'll be able to really dig in. Thank you. So, Larry, I'm hearing this is just, I love the promise here, and I'm really excited about it. And I hear how much does it depend on, or does the success of this kind of project depend on a level of trust at the outset? and maybe this is, I'm going to have to go dig into those 14 examples where the trust had been violated and then rebuilt. But how do you go in and build that trust so that everybody is willing and able to engage in that process?
I wrote a book with my colleague Pat Field some years ago called Dealing with an Angry Public. And it has 5 or 6 major cases from New England in it. And the regulators and the developers look at this angry public and trying to figure out how to quiet them down, how to shut them down, how to prove them wrong. And they start by saying, well, we ought to sit together and you ought to hear what the facts are that we, the developers and regulators, know. And it always begins with, and you should trust us. And as the mediator of those sessions, I would say neither side should trust either side at the outset of any such process. There's no basis for trust. You should not be trusting. But I will say, if both sides would agree to start out trying to be trustworthy, then we have a chance of building trust during this conversation. But I would never ask people to be trusting as a way of restoring trust. There's no basis for it. And if you ask, well, what does trustworthiness consist of? 2 really, really simple rules. Say what you mean. Don't disguise, mask, exaggerate. Don't cover stuff up. And even so you can say later, well, I told you that, but yeah, right. Well, I presented the best version of it. Say what you mean. And the second simple rule, mean what you say. Don't make a promise you have no guarantee you can implement. Don't make a promise that still depends on other people in your organization having to say, okay. The first time you make a promise that you don't keep, trust is broken for good. So when you raise the issue of trust, I don't think we need trust to start these processes. You need people to agree to enter promising to be trustworthy. That's just how they're going to behave. And then it's up to the neutral party that's mediating this, not the developer, not paid for by the developer, not paid for by the town, has to be an independent party who knows about the substance of the issues and who understands the details of a process of the sort I've described to bear witness. That's what the mediator is doing, bear witness. And the mediator does the stakeholder assessment to help suggest who the parties should be at the table, because you're going to go from a very large number to a manageable number. Manageable number might be 30 or 40, but they could have 900,000 people who expressed an interest and are stakeholders. So we've got to figure out how to cluster the stakeholders and let them choose ad hoc representatives, not from existing organizations only, to be at the table on their behalf. And those folks need to be able to carry on a conversation, not expecting to be quoted in the morning in the newspaper, but exploring possibilities. And it's the mediator's job to make sure that those conversations proceed as promised and that there's a witness. If somebody said they were going to do something and they did the opposite, everybody there doesn't have to go out and say, see, I told you, don't believe them. The neutral can say the process has to stop because the key parties are not living up to the ground rules that we all agreed to and help write at the beginning.
You see that folks being aligned on that, like agreement about uh, those when those foundational agreements are being kept or not, or do you sometimes see the sort of classic, like we walk out and say, wait, were we at the same meeting? Because it felt different to me, or it seemed, I thought that this was happening, but you thought that was happening. How do we sort of facilitate for that or design for that sort of?
It's up to the mediation team in the last 10 minutes to summarize what seemed to be all the points of agreement and disagreement and give anybody a chance to correct anything that's wrong and produce a written summary of those points of an agreement and disagreement without anyone's names attached to the points and send them out the next day to everybody who was there so they can talk to the people that they ostensibly are representing in this ad hoc conversation. So what you described shouldn't happen in a mediated context. Most people have never sat through a mediated problem-solving context in their organization, interorganizationally, in their community. It isn't because we don't have trained mediators who know how to do this. It's just not been part of what we included in the description of what democracy requires. You get to go to a hearing. You get to have your 2 minutes at the microphone. There's got to be a moderator who shuts everybody up for your 2 minutes. You get to put comments in. The agency has to show that it had your comments. None of that is about dialogue. None of it. Democracy doesn't appear to require dialogue and problem solving. There's nothing in the Constitution or anywhere else that says you can't do it, but it hasn't been what we've chosen. But we now have agencies beginning to see you're in a big hurry. You want to have this energy transition take place. You want to build renewable energy. Well, right now, 20% of the projects that have been proposed in the last few years, they're stopped. That's, 20% of whatever number of megawatts you thought you'd have. You're not going to have them unless you change the process. And it goes back to those assumptions about when, who gets to have what kind of involvement in making which decisions, and when agreements are reached, how they become enforceable.
And how can we navigate that when groups are coming to the table with different resources or power or sometimes even different bodies of information, right? Pointing to different interpretations or sometimes different facts.
The mediation team, and it's rarely a single person, needs in these conversations with everybody to determine who the stakeholders are, to scope an agenda of issues that the parties really care about. And when the mediator finds issues that the parties care about, it's the mediator's job to organize a joint fact-finding effort to summarize what we know, what we don't know, what's agreed, what's not agreed, what's been tried elsewhere, what hasn't been tried elsewhere, in a very efficient, short form, and give everyone that to start with. Then it's the mediator's job to meet with each of the parties privately before each meeting and say, what are you worried about for this meeting? What questions do you still have? What information do you wish you still had? And it's the mediation team's job to do the best they can to assemble information for everybody that comes from asking everybody, what capacity do you feel you need to build to participate effectively? Sounds like we're going to need to talk about this highly technical question this week. We can talk to 3 people who are not working for any parties in this particular case, and we can get you 2-page descriptions of what we know. We can get you an example of a place just like what's being discussed, and we can interview 3 of the people who participated in that, and we can capture that interview and have that ready for the mediated session. Everything is ad hoc in response to what the parties feel they need to know about. It's not, we're giving you a huge book, study it before we start, and that should take care of your technical interests. Or send somebody from your group who knows this stuff. And then all you do is you get a replay of fixed points of view. So you avoid that by the joint fact finding, by consulting with each group. Some groups will say, we don't need to talk to you. Fine. Other groups say, we don't have anybody on the technical side in our group, and we're going to talk about these two issues this week. We would like a 1-hour session with our whole group. Will you, the mediation staff, come and talk with us? And we do different things for different groups. We're not telling anyone what the answers are. We're not telling anyone what to do, but we offer to all parties capacity building in response to the questions they have. And we are not selling any point of view on anything for the developer or for the regulator or for anybody else.
One of the things that we've done a lot of at Maine Conservation Voters is to try to understand the climate of disinformation, or the landscape of disinformation and misinformation that is out there. And unfortunately, we've sometimes found that there are the really legitimate, thoughtful concerns and questions that real people have can sometimes bump up against the I'll call it what it is, messaging from the fossil fuel industry. And I'm curious about what the role of mediation is in sort of distinguishing between solid information, misinformation that's just misunderstandings, and sort of we're not all on the same page yet, and that really active and insidious disinformation campaign that we certainly see in our work.
It's getting worse. Anybody who wants to read about this in the energy world probably already knows who Leah Stokes is. And Leah, who was my doctoral student, so I'm very proud of the work that she's done as a professor now. Yes, the fossil fuel industry continues. It's not just something that happened in the past. Continues in specific situations to disseminate information that's questionable from an independent technical standpoint. But imagine you're in a session and someone comes to this session, there's 30, 40 people there, there's an issue on the agenda, and someone says, if you do that, this will happen. And we heard that from this source, published source, here it is, it's on the web. And as the mediator, I would say, we need a chance to see what others with the relevant background say about whether, when that happens, this occurs. And we need a chance to bring in 2 or 3 individuals who are not part of this discussion and who are not working for one side or another side, to understand in a fact-based way, in a performance-based way, what the different views are. I don't say that there's a truth, but it's really interesting when the next conversation on that subject, someone says, who we asked to come in, well, I don't know who the person was who wrote that piece on the web. There were not legitimate, doesn't have to be footnotes, but sources. And they say that if you put solar panels this high off the ground, it is not possible to sustain agriculture under those panels. And then the next meeting we come and we bring a person from Cornell online who's for 5 years been running very detailed studies to determine what grows well, animals and plants, under solar panels, and does it hurt the animal or does it hurt the plant that it's producing solar energy from solar rays. And there's now, in the last 5 years, very substantial documentation, I would argue, from legitimate scientific sources that I think other people would have problem faulting the research design and the research findings, which we can put right next to danger. Cannot raise animals anywhere near solar farm. Cannot grow anything under the solar farm. And we say, doesn't look like everybody agrees with that. Oh, and here's some video of the studies done by Cornell Lab. And here's some videos of Vermont sheep farmers putting their sheep onto a truck and taking them 10 miles and letting them out at the solar farm that's been running for several years to eat all of the growing things under all of the panels, saving the energy company a very substantial amount, because you got to keep that clear underneath. And the farmers now, I mean, the sheep herders now have a new source of revenue. They're really excited about this. And they're out trying to be part of all proposals for new solar farms, all hinging on the beginning statements were really adamant. But when you search them, and when you have somebody who knows that field say, okay, fine, what was the evidence that was based on? Let me talk to that author. The author has nothing to say. They said, well, it's obvious. One of my students tracked down one of these folks. Their answer is, it's obvious. And so we wrote it that way and said, well, you would be surprised to know, here's a site you can look at. So you need to have people who can engage with the people putting out false information on scientific and technical terms, but who are not advocates for one point of view or another in the project that appear to flow from the decision. I'm talking about the reliability of the evidence. I'm talking about the reasonableness of the forecast, the models, and the assumptions. I'm talking about the actual documentation. I'm talking about examples, counterexamples to what someone's saying. So how do you explain this if you could be talking online during the meeting to the person who said, it has to be this high, has to be this far, can't be this, can't be that, or you can't have a wind farm that close to a military base because the lights at the top of the towers are going to confuse the pilots. And we know that the Army and the Air Force is totally opposed to wind farms within X miles of military bases. So then we go get a list of all the wind farms operating on the West Coast within much closer distance of military bases. We have the details on how far they are from there. We have the transcripts of the conversations that happened in order to get approval to build and to get the approval of the military. And we carry that from there to Connecticut and we bring it into the conversation. We say, how come these soldiers, how come these military leaders said okay to these facilities after stipulating this height, this distance, and an agreement to follow certain rules? And all of that false information melts.
I like the way that ended. I like the whole process, but I like getting to the misinformation melting away. I'm wanted to say, just share one thing. There have been a bunch of questions in the chat about how do we get this process in Maine? And I just wanted to share, I have been very, very lucky and honored to be a part of the Maine Climate Council's steering committee and to co-chair the buildings working group of that process. And I'm delighted to tell you all that the Climate Council has been working very, very closely with the Consensus Building Institute that Larry founded. And so this process that we've been talking about in this hour is very much what the Climate Council has been going through in terms of engaging really broad stakeholders. And I could talk about that forever. I'm not going to make Larry talk about it, but I want to let you know that this kind of work is happening here in Maine. And want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about other parts of the world. And as hard as it is to do this work here in Maine, we know it's happening slowly, steadily, sometimes imperfectly, but happening. Are there processes like this happening in the global south where mining and extractive industries are really devastating a lot of communities and without a lot of community input? Are there participatory approaches in other parts of the world that are coming close to what you're describing here?
No, there's a desire on the part of a number of key actors to move in that direction in the global south. But I cannot point to places in the global south where what I described is in operation. We are trying to ally with universities, technical universities in countries like India, and say you could have a clinic like the MIT clinic where students could be trained to provide assistance in controversies concerning the siting of renewable energy. And I'm hoping that within a year, we'll have a consortium of universities offering that. They're going to meet very strong resistance from state and federal government because that's what the world is like in those places. Can I just swing from that back to Maine for just a minute? I'm hoping there's at least one legislator online today. A simple draft of a bill that would modify the existing siting law in Maine. The governor created a special commission, is trying to do this in Massachusetts. We have tried to get this commission to please listen and to not do the wrong things. And we're trying to build legislation around community benefit agreements. It seems to me to be the simplest thing. So you write a law that says, in our siting law, when the state says it will give a permit, it says you have to do an environmental impact assessment. It's now normal. Like everyone expects to do that. I think they should amend the siting law in every state and say, and there should have to be a community benefits agreement. And that agreement should have to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It should have to be signed by the local officials after there was a process of consultation in that community run by an independent mediator, maybe funded, but certainly supported by the state siting agency. This CBA has to talk about projected benefits to the community and what it's done to try to maximize them in conjunction with this project. It has to talk about likely costs and to different parties, even though the project looks licensable, who stands to lose what. It has to talk about what mitigation efforts the developer will make and the community will make for those who are not being held harmless, what compensation for those for whom mitigation isn't sufficient. And there has to be a written agreement and it has to be signed by local officials and the developer. And we're assuming that the local officials won't do that until holding a hearing to allow people to say, yeah, I was in the process by which this was produced. And then the developer will have no choice but to submit that community benefit agreement and refigure the cost of their project and the design of their project to take account of what was negotiated in that community benefit agreement. And then the state law that's getting changed has to say that the state agency is responsible for implementing those community benefit agreements. Just coming in around that, adding that as an element required by the state in the siting process, I think will move the whole state siting process forward in the direction I'm describing.
Larry, we're gonna wrap up today with a little bit of a this is your life moment where we pull different people from your past. No, I've got a message from Brian Hubble, who I think you'll remember from MIT, who says he's now working in the speakers. He's a former Maine state legislator and working in the speaker's office now, and says we would love to look at a bill draft. So that's something to look forward to. And I would like to pass the mic just briefly to David Plum, who's helped to convene the Maine Labor or the Maine Climate Council's work, and also has a couple of other little bits to share. David, you want to jump in?
Thanks, Kathleen, and always good to spend a little time with Larry as well. For folks who don't know me, I work with the Consensus Building Institute, which is the organization Larry founded back in the 90s to do this work. I've been with CBI since about 2005, so it's a little scary how long that is. I'm here right here in Portland, Maine, back in my hometown of Portland, Maine for the last 4 or 5 years, very happily so. I still oversee our work in Latin America. And there was just a quick mention about what's happening elsewhere in the global south. And I will say that there is good activity happening. You know, CBI is helping to guide a process around lithium extraction in northern Chile, the first ever process of bringing indigenous communities with other actors and the lithium producers to do the kind of joint fact-finding Larry's talking about water and about the hydrology of that very dry desert, and trying to have some shared information about what's really going on there. So these processes are happening around the world in different places, and on these issues that are critical for climate. I think a lot of folks on this call probably are concerned about the social and environmental footprint of lithium that's going to be crucial to our energy future. And so right here in Maine, we do have some capacity, and I'm very happy to be working more on the policy level than the specific project level so far in Maine. And that's where Kathleen and I are together in the Climate Council, trying to guide a good process and bringing lots of voices into that effort. And by the way, Kathleen will note that in the Energy Working Group and the Climate Council is working specifically on recommendations, or set specific recommendations that are aligned with what Larry's saying about how local communities should be involved in the process of siting and building out the clean energy infrastructure that Maine is going to need. So that stuff is getting baked into recommendations in good processes like the Climate Council. So that's all I'll say. I'm right here in Portland and happy to be helpful for folks.
Thank you so much, David. And just so everybody knows, we're going to send you a really juicy follow-up email with links to a lot of what we've been talking about. And I'm so glad that we're ending with the Maine Climate Council's work. Many of you know that the state is in the process of developing our next 4-year plan for climate action. That work has been ongoing, and there are actually surveys available right now to give you an opportunity to weigh in. It's not the first or the last opportunity for public input, but we're going to link to all of that in the follow-up email so that you can think about the courses and the research that Larry has shared and begin to put it into practice right here at home. We could go for the entirety of that course and not run out of things to talk about, important issues to tackle together. I am so grateful to all of you for being here with us for this hour. Dr. Susskind, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate all of you for taking this time today. We will be back in this space next week for another really meaty but very different conversation. We're going to be talking about the growing movement for returning land to Indigenous nations and hear about the work that the Trust for Public Land is doing right here in the land we now call Maine, to restore nearly 30,000 acres to the Penobscot Nation. I hope you will join us. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and thank you for being in this work of co-creating the future. It takes all of us, and we're getting there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Larry.